Hello everyone, it's Hannah here from Virtually Fluent. Welcome to today's video, which is all things questions. We are going to look at all the different forms of asking questions in English, a couple of the exceptions. I've got some important notes for you too, so hopefully you can ask questions, any type of question, correctly in English. It's a really tricky topic and it can be a bit of a marathon to get through this topic. But hopefully with today's video, you'll feel a lot more confident asking any kind of question in English. So let's get started with all things questions. So today we're going to look at 5 different types of questions. We're going to start with looking through all of the tenses. Then we're going to move on to some different kind of verb structures. We're also going to quickly review question tags and indirect questions, and then I've got a few extra notes and tips for you too. So the most common way of asking questions in English is by using the tenses. You may already know that we have 12 tenses in English, and each of those tenses has a really specific structure for asking questions. This is because all of them use different auxiliary verbs to help create the tense. Now, in general, within all of these tenses, you can ask either closed questions or open questions. Now, closed questions are where you would expect probably a one-word answer, typically yes, no, maybe, and you can have more specific answers like absolutely or no way. We also have open questions, which is where we ask for more detailed information. You'll know these question words: who, what, where, when, why, etc. And these require really specific information, and people would respond typically with more than one word. So here you can see a quick summary of all of the 12 tenses and the structures that we might use. You can see an example question for each of these tenses. There are only 2 tenses where we have to be really careful, and this is the present simple and the past simple tenses. And this is because we actually have 2 different structures that we could use in both of those tenses. We actually have the extra verb to be, which could be used as the auxiliary verb instead of do, does in the present simple and did in the past simple. So let's look at both closed questions and open questions in general through all of these 12 tenses. The typical structure would be first your auxiliary verb, then your subject, then your main verb, and then finally the rest of the sentence. For example, in the present simple tense, do you walk to work? Do is our auxiliary verb, you our subject, walk is our main verb. In this case it's in the infinitive, but in other tenses it might be in a different form. It might be the past participle, the present participle, and then finally the rest of the sentence, which can have as much content as you like. Do note that in some tenses you have more than one auxiliary verb. If that's the case, the second auxiliary verb will go after the subject and before the main verb. Now, do remember that I spoke about those present simple and past simple tenses having 2 different possibilities. That's because we also can use the verb to be instead of the verb to do. Now, the verb to be is a little bit selfish. It doesn't really like sharing its question with other verbs. So in this case, the main verb, the verb to be, will go first, then the subject, and then you'll have no other verbs. So it will just be the rest of the sentence. For example, is he happy? And in the past simple, was he happy? Now, if we move on to those open questions, all we're going to do is insert a question word at the beginning of all of those questions before the auxiliary verb. And this is the same again in all 12 tenses. Question word, auxiliary verb, subject, main verb, which can be in any form, and the rest of the sentence. For example, why does he walk to work? And again, if you have a second or even a third auxiliary verb, that will go between the subject and the main verb. Remember that the present simple and the past simple have those 2 additional forms with the verb to be, but it's exactly the same. We put the question word right at the very beginning. For example, why is he happy? Or in the past simple, why was he happy? And that's how we ask questions in all 12 of these tenses. You simply need to learn the right auxiliary verb for each tense. There are a couple of things that I would like to draw your attention to. First of all is inserting objects into the question. This is because a few of our question words can add extra objects. What, which, and how much, how many can often add a noun, and the question word how can often add an adjective. For example, what activity are you doing? And you'll notice here that that noun, that object, goes immediately after the question word. Which date have you reserved? Or how many chocolates will you buy? And with how, we tend to add adjectives. For example, how big was the house? The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is inserting prepositions into our questions, which is also possible. In general, your preposition is going to go after the main verb, and that's because the preposition will be connected to the main verb. In this case, I've got the expression to look at something. So my question is, who is he looking at? The preposition there is at the end of the question. When we use the verb to be, because we don't actually have another verb, it tends to be an adjective plus a preposition, a dependent preposition. In this case, to be good at something. So my question is, what is he good at? Again, the preposition is at the end. The structure is the same. Now we do have something really special with these prepositional questions, and that's because we can often put the preposition right at the very beginning of our question and then our question word. Now this is an extremely formal way of speaking. To be honest, people don't use this very much nowadays, but it is possible, so just be aware of that. So in this case, our question would slightly change to at whom is he looking? I just need to change the who to whom because this question is now receiving. It's becoming an object rather than a subject in the sentence. And it's also important to note that we can slightly cut our question to just the preposition and the question word. And this is often if someone has given you some information, but you're not quite sure what they were saying, or maybe you didn't hear them. So you want to ask a short clipped question rather than the whole question. And in that case, we just use preposition plus question word. For example, I might say, oh, he's looking at Sarah. You didn't hear who he was looking at, so you'd say, at whom? Now, the third thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the type of auxiliary verbs that are used, because in all of the questions we've seen so far, our auxiliary verbs have been positive in the affirmative form. And that's very, very typical in questions, but the more advanced you become in English, you'll also learn that our auxiliary verbs can be put into their negative forms. And this is the case for all 12 tenses, all the structures that we've seen so far, also with or without an object, also with or without a preposition, both open and closed questions. Here are a few examples of some closed questions. This is when we start with the auxiliary verb. We take the same auxiliary verb from each tense. So we know in the present simple, it's do, does, and we just put them into their negative forms. This is exactly the same with a question word at the beginning. We can also ask restricted choice questions, and this is simply building on our open questions. So we start with an open question, for example, what is for dinner tonight? And then we restrict the answer of the person, in this case, pizza. Now we have converted that open question pretty much down to a closed question where they can only really say yes, no, maybe, or they can respond with a different answer. No hot dogs, for example. Now, final note that I'd like to make is a particularly native way of asking questions. You can see a couple of examples here. Now, this is only possible with our closed questions. So that's those that typically start with an auxiliary verb. For example, do you walk to work? And what we actually do is cut that first auxiliary verb, completely take it out, and start our question with the subject instead. You walk to work? Now, this is a really informal way of speaking, but you may hear it, so it's important to understand this structure. And with the verb to be, it's exactly the same. Instead of saying, is he happy, we eliminate that auxiliary verb to be and just say, he happy? And again, it's a really informal way of speaking. So that is, in summary, how we ask questions in English using the 12 tenses. I'd now like to move on to some special verb structures. Now these are actually exactly the same, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the auxiliary verb is then a special verb. It might be a modal verb, for example, can, must, might, may, should, and in this case we follow that structure auxiliary verb or special modal verb, then our subject, then our main verb, which after a modal verb would be the infinitive, and finally the rest of the sentence. Another structure that we might have is with conditionals, so this is using would and if clauses. For example, would you go to France if I bought you a ticket? Now that is in the case of closed questions for both modal verbs and conditionals. If it's an open question, it's exactly the same as the tense structures. We just insert that question word at the beginning. For example, how can you dance so well? And as a conditional, when would you go to France if I could buy you a ticket? Now the next topic is question tags. You can see a few examples here, and we do have an entire separate video on creating question tags with all of the notes about that topic, but we will quickly run through them now. As you can see from these examples here, a question tag is just added onto the end of a statement and it converts that statement into a question. Now it's typically created by using an auxiliary verb plus a subject, and that is it. No names, so you would need to replace names with the appropriate pronoun and the auxiliary verb. Now the most important rule with question tags is that it needs to be a balance. So when the verb is affirmative in one side, it needs to be negative in the question tag, and the other way round. If the main sentence has a negative verb, then your question tag needs to be in affirmative. So we always need that balance. And you simply have to learn which auxiliary verb is used in each of the tenses. You can see some examples here from the 4 present forms. Again, in the present simple tense, remember we have those 2 structures. We have those with the verb to do, and we also have those with the verb to be. Here you can see the structures for the 4 past forms. Again, in the past simple, you have the verb to do, which is actually did in the past, and you have the verb to be, which is was, were in the past. And here you can see the future forms, which is nice and simple because actually it's will in all of these tenses. A few other important notes with question tags is that there is and there are can also be copied. There isn't, there aren't. Modal verbs can also be used in the same way with their positive and negative forms. We can go to the shops, can't we? Or they must work, mustn't they? And a couple of extra notes is that when we make suggestions using let's, for example, let's go to the shops, then our question tag is actually shall we? Sometimes you'll hear shan't we? And the final one is if we ask, well, actually, if we command something, for example, give me that book, then you can use will as the question tag auxiliary verb, will you? And sometimes you'll also hear the negative form, won't you? So that's everything that you need to know about question tags. As I said, we've got an entirely separate video that goes into each of those structures in more detail and lots more examples, so you can check that out. I will leave the link to that video in the description below. But our next question structure is indirect questions. Again, we have an entirely separate video on this. We're just going to summarize this today. Indirect questions are a really useful, colloquial way of asking questions in English. And that's because at the beginning of our question, we actually insert these question phrases. So it slightly alters the structure of the question. It's not the same as our typical tenses. And this is because after our question structure, we then have our question word, then our subject, and then our verb afterwards, whether it's an auxiliary verb or a main verb. For example, could you tell me how you are? So we don't flip the first verb and the subject like we do in typical tense structures and with those other modal verbs and verb structures. However, we can insert objects in these cases. For example, we can add an adjective after how, and then we can add nouns after what, which, and whose. When we use modal verbs in indirect questions, it's exactly the same, that the modal verb and the infinitive verb will be pushed after the subject. For example, could you tell me where we can park? And it's the same if it's an auxiliary verb, if it's a tense that requires an auxiliary verb. For example, here is a sentence in the present perfect tense. Our auxiliary verb is has, have. Could you tell me where he has gone? So all those verbs are after the subject, like a general statement. We can also use indirect questions when there aren't question words. All the examples we've seen so far have had question words. However, if it doesn't have a question word, if it's just an auxiliary, we do need to insert an extra word, either if or whether. For example, do you know if she's okay? However, you can see that the structure is exactly the same. All the verbs are after the subject. That's the general rule with indirect questions. Verbs are after the subjects. It would be the same if it's a modal verb. Do you know if she can drive? And as I said, we can insert whether instead of if. Whether is perhaps a little bit more formal, if is slightly more common and colloquial. But here is an example, and this one shows an auxiliary verb. Do you know whether, if, he will visit me? Something to be aware of with indirect questions is with the present simple and past simple tenses. This is because we actually don't insert auxiliary verbs. We take out any auxiliary verbs which you would typically use in direct tense questions. So instead of saying, where does he work? We have that auxiliary verb, do, does. We take that out and we convert the main verb, work, into a conjugated verb. In this case, because our subject is he, it's he works with an S. So insert your question phrase at the beginning. I would like to know where he works. Not where does he work, where he works. So just be careful with indirect questions in the present simple tense. Here's another example with the do form. Who do you like? I would like to know who you like. And it's the same in the past simple too. So where did he go would be, could you tell me where he went? And remember that your main verb will need to be in the past simple tense. So if it's an irregular verb, make sure that you use it correctly. Here's a quick summary of those three different structures when we are asking indirect questions, or we've inserted indirect questions into our conversation. We do have an entirely separate video, so we go a little bit more into detail with this, go through the structure very slowly, and I've left the link to that video also in the description below. Now, the final thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is just two special types of question structure that we have. This is statement questions and echo questions. So let's start with those statement questions. This is basically where we convert a statement into a question. So again, grammatically, it doesn't follow our typical structures. Perhaps you are surprised or maybe confused by the statement. So you're actually repeating what somebody else has said as a statement, but you just use your intonation to turn it into a question. The second structure is the echo question. Now, this is where you partially heard what somebody has said, so you can use that information in your question, but you didn't get all of the information, so you're kind of echoing what the first person has said. For example, person A says, I speak English, but you didn't hear which language they spoke. So then you would echo that question and say, you speak what? Now here you can see that, again, it's more like a statement. We have our subject, our main verb, and then our question word at the end. You speak what? However, these echo questions can only be used following on from what somebody else has said, where you're not sure about the information. Do not use these questions as main starter questions. That is incorrect in English, so make sure you're only using them as an echo. Here's another example. I speak 3 languages. You speak how many languages? And again, you want to use your rising intonation to make sure that people know it's a question. And in this case, it's the same subject, main verb, question word, but in this case, we've also got an object after how many. If you're using an auxiliary verb, it would be exactly the same, but remember, auxiliary verbs come before main verbs. For example, I have been to the shops. You have been where, and again that question word is at the end. So, as you can see, asking questions is a really tricky topic in English. It's really quite difficult to get every type of question correct. We have a whole series of different videos, for example, on question tags, on indirect questions, and individual videos on all of the tenses in English. I've left the links to those in the description below, so if you'd like to go into more detail about any of these question structures in English, do check those out. If you do have any questions about questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'll try my best to get back to you. But that's everything for today. If you did learn something new or simply enjoyed today's video, please go ahead and give us a like, a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn notifications on so you know exactly when we're releasing new videos on English grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary, and also general videos on British culture and life here in the UK, all in the hope of helping you boost your English language level. That's it for today. This is Hannah from Virtually Fluent, bringing English to life.